Thanks for coming today. Really excited to be here. I am a senior product manager at Amazon Web Services. Specifically, I work as part of the mobile services team, and we have a few different areas of technology to talk to today when it comes to React Native that I'm going to go through. And really where I want to start this presentation and talking through some things is I want to talk about apps that you might be looking to build. Some things that you can do today with React Native and AWS are things like strong authentication techniques. So I'm actually going to spend a bit of time talking about the challenges today for React Native to really make it to the next level, and maybe even piggyback a little bit off of what Brent was saying around talking about the great things about React Native today, as well as what we see from an AWS perspective, some challenges for implementing things like strong authentication, for example. I'm going to go into some other things, though, past that around APIs and serverless logic, pub/sub techniques. I'm going to talk about analytics and targeted messaging, streaming and uploading and downloading content in different ways, either actively or passively in the background as well. So the point is on this, though, this is kind of all I have time to talk through today, and we're going to attempt to do a little bit of a couple of demos as well. But you can do a lot more, obviously. If you've ever used AWS services, we have a lot of them. And sometimes it's a little bit daunting. So my hope is today to kind of give a drive-by overview of some things that you can do to get started today, talk to you about some samples that we've produced specifically for this conference, and also encourage you to give us some feedback and look a little bit more into the future, which I'll end with that for some takeaways. So for some of those scenarios that I talked about that you might be trying to build real-time apps or request response type applications for CRUD services and other types of new business applications you're creating. I realize not everybody's familiar with all the AWS services that they might interact with in this space, so I'm going to do a few minutes of an overview of that. The first is usually the most common question is how do I get started with authentication on AWS? And we have a service known as Amazon Cognito for this. And this will allow you to do different types of authentication, so authn, as well as use something known as federation, so it's Amazon Cognito Federated Identities, to federate you with different identity providers. And these could be classical OIDC type providers. These could be social providers like Facebook, Google+, Twitter, where you're getting OAuth tokens. This can also even be enterprise type applications like SAML providers. After you've gotten started with the AWS platform and you're able to authenticate and authorize your users successfully, what are some things that you can do? Well, you could leverage a serverless platform to have kind of a front door to your ecosystem. We have something called Amazon API Gateway that allows you to do this. And it's fully managed APIs that you can either have strong paths and resources for users accessing different resources and use it as kind of a proxy to other services, or you can use something that I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes, which is a proxy plus kind of greedy method of specifying URIs. You can even use this for things like having policies on if certain users will have a deluxe plan of your application versus a basic plan, and set throttling limits and things like that. Of course, once you've given a front door to people, you need somewhere to execute some business logic. So one of our most popular services in this area is AWS Lambda. And this is serverless compute, where you're essentially running your code and business logic in the cloud. And this can be many languages, Java, Python, but the most popular one that I usually find when I'm working with React Native developers is Node.js, of course, right? Because it's kind of sticking with your own language here. And I'm going to talk about in a minute how you can do this with Express-based applications. Additionally, some other services that not many people are that familiar with yet, but we hope to change this maybe today, is doing targeted analytics as well as targeted notifications on different communications mediums using React Native. We have a service that we released late last year called Pinpoint for this, which builds on top of other services that we had in the past, things like mobile analytics and SNS, so that you can essentially gather all sorts of analytics and then, for groups of people, send them messages, either push notifications or texts or email, and slice and dice as you like with some logic in the cloud. Also, we have AWS IoT, which we released, I think, a year and a half ago or so, which is a real-time pub/sub system that uses a protocol that's gotten quite popular in mobile development these days, MQTT. So that's message queue telemetry transport, which is exclusively designed for operations on lossy networks where you can set different quality of service levels, like just fire and forget with a QoS 0, or actually get an ACK back from a device with a QoS 1. And additionally, what I'm not going to talk about too deep in today is also in my group, we manage a service known as Mobile Hub as well as Device Farm. And these are services for quickly getting up and running, both either just kind of dragging and dropping in the console and selecting services, and we scaffold some code out to you. Or I'm going to talk about a different flow later today, which is starting at an external resource like a GitHub repo. And we've recently launched some features that make it easier for JavaScript developers to basically click a button, get a templated backend up and running, and then you get some JavaScript configuration that you can drop into your React Native apps. Also, in our group, we have a service known as Device Farm, which I'm not going to go into detail today, but we do have members at our booth that if you want to come and get a demo and talk more about it. And these are real devices in the cloud that they're non-jailbroken, actually come from the different phone providers. But you can run your apps on real devices in the cloud and take videos of them, interact with them, run automated tests with things like Robotium, Appium, and so forth. You can even simulate lossy networks. And one of the things that's really important when it comes to mobile development, especially what we found out in the React Native ecosystem when testing different algorithms, is it might run fine in dev, but you really do need to actually see how it's going to work on a real device to know how your users are going to interact with it. So let's start with the first one. Imagine you have a application that's like, I'm going to use a specific example here. It's a restaurant system. And you want people from your mobile device to be able to view restaurants, select them, view the menus, place orders, and stuff. We're actually releasing a serverless sample for this later on in the week. It's going to be a React sample, and we're going to quickly start working on a React Native example, but you can see the parallels pretty easy. So how would you do this with AWS services today using React Native? Well, the first is you'd use that service that I mentioned before, which is Amazon Cognito for getting credentials. Then you'd call the React Native Fetch API. And there's a couple of things to note here. First is API Gateway will have an invocation URL that you can specify, and that's essentially a URI that you pass. You'd also need to specify some credentials to interact with that service, right? So we support things like no authentication, first of all, but you could send classic bearer tokens, whether they're your own company's bearer tokens or OIDC ones that are vended. You can also use something known as signature version 4 signing, which is a quote-unquote cloud native type of authentication that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail later on. After this, you can have a greedy path that you can specify on API Gateway so that anything goes to the back end. And why this is really nice for mobile developers, especially in the React Native world, is you can basically then use Express, for example, which we have a library that you can load into a Lambda function, and then from a code standpoint, manage what's going to happen when users in your application click on different links and stuff like that, right? So maybe it's just listing restaurants, maybe it's placing orders, maybe it's other things. But by using kind of this workflow, everything's streamlined for you, and you can just focus on your code rather than the infrastructure. The next one is this pub sub broker I was talking about, which is AWS IoT. We have a lot of customers that are playing around with this, not just for pub sub from React Native device to React Native device, but even as the consumerization of IoT devices become more prevalent in our world, right? You might have React Native devices that want to interact with the light bulbs or with toasters and things like that. This has a SQLite rules engine on it so that you can do publish and subscribe to different topics, classic pub sub architecture, and then filter it so that, if different items happen to match, different predicates or where clauses, via an MQTT channel, you can send messages only to subgroups of listeners on different channels. So what this kind of looks like is, you have your React Native device that communicates with the server over a secure WebSocket signed channel. Using our signature version 4 process. You can then use WebSocket over MQTT, so you can not just leverage an HTTP upgrade with an MQTT or with a WebSocket channel, but a very fine-tuned protocol using MQTT over a lossy network to publish and subscribe events. From there, it's kind of routing to different devices as you please. So I'm going to show a little bit of an example of this later. We've also got this concept of, after you're interacting either in a serverless pattern or in a pub sub type broker, how do you gather data? How do you gather KPIs and so forth from your user base? Well, a service that we've got for this is Pinpoint, which is essentially, adding a little SDK onto your React Native application, sending events to the service, and then targeting groups of users either via push, either via SMS or email. So these might be people that are just fans of one specific sports team. Maybe you're trying to send different sports teams messages or the same one, but you're not sure the exact message to send to them. You can do things like A/B testing. And we actually published a blog post last year around this. If you look at the AWS mobile blog, it was not actually last year. I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago. But to where we basically gather analytics on people of Earth or Mars or other planets in the solar system. And depending if they're Earth people or not, you can send them an SMS or a push notification as you like. And these can also not only be just group type messaging, but they can be one-to-one messages, right? Transactional based push notifications, and provide funnel analytics and KPIs after that. Now the other common question, in fact I got it a couple times last night at dinner on some stuff, is how do I just do some basic stuff, like maybe I want to display some video to my users, right, on a decision-making process and stuff like that. Well, with AWS this is actually pretty easy. Essentially all you need is what's known as an S3 bucket, or you could front that via CDN like CloudFront if you wanted to. And if you're not familiar with this, there's a great open source component, React Native Video, that you can install on your platform. And from there, it's basically just specifying a URI. Now, there's multiple ways to get these videos, either from, or get the location of these videos, either from buckets that you manually create, or you can use a new JavaScript configuration that we've made specifically for the JavaScript ecosystem as part of our mobile hub service. However, for really large videos, what we usually end up recommending is, you can buffer and stream smaller videos, maybe in the megabyte size live. But if you're talking about gigabyte size videos and, especially for training material, we recommend kind of caching and prefetching that content locally, and then kind of having a file system pointer to load from there. Let's talk about uploading. This is essentially my transition into a couple of the areas where we found that we've had to bridge quite a bit recently for different reasons. So first of all, in just our regular AWS JavaScript SDK, we have a managed uploader that's really good for doing high concurrency when it comes to partitioning large files, either videos or images, and using something known as multi-part upload for buffers and byte streams, and uploading that content and having it reassembled at a cloud endpoint. About 2 months ago, I think it was, we officially started supporting React Native in the AWS JavaScript SDK. It's probably your first place to start for React Native support, and you can just install it via NPM. Up until, I think, 6 hours ago, you could NPM install it, and you had to just do one small change to the require statement. But we just published a packaging fix this morning that will allow you just to do a standard import of the AWS SDK like you would if you were writing a React app or anything else. And you can leverage utilities like this. Now, that being said, many times a lot of customers want to do background uploads, especially for really large content. So a text message might come in, they might put their app into the background, or they just kind of close it. We have a couple of managed uploaders for this. So we have one for iOS and one for Android. The iOS one, because of the OS, has a little bit more limitations. So it can only, we basically get a pre-signed URL, the location of the bucket, and we pass it to a background task. And because of the way the OS actually handles this, the longest you can do is 30 seconds. So if you have an image that needs take longer than that, you're probably going to need to use the managed uploader while the UI is present to the user. On Android, we can do a little bit more. We can start a background service. Doesn't spin up if it's transferring. Automatically does multi-part upload for you. And even if the app crashes, we're basically snapshotting the state of that locally to a local data storage, and then we'll restart it if the app starts up again. Now, here's some stuff where it gets a little bit trickier. And especially as React Native starts to get more prevalent in the communities and more enterprises and businesses start adopting it, these are some techniques around authentication and authorization that are really important to keep in mind, because it allows the ecosystem to be taken very seriously by businesses. And as I mentioned earlier, Cognito is essentially our front door for mobile devices and mobile web in general for people doing authentication and authorization. And it vends, classic OIDC tokens. So these are JWT tokens, access token, ID tokens, refresh tokens. But one of the things that it does is it uses a protocol known as SRP, which you can read about on Stanford's website. This is Secure Remote Password Protocol. And this is a method for essentially not transferring passwords over the wire. They never physically leave the device. So this is an authenticated key exchange protocol so that any listeners over the network, even if they see subsequent successful authentication requests, they can't really garner any useful information to try to run mechanisms against those keys really quickly or those sessions and extract the password. I wanted to give a little bit under the covers on how this works and talk about why this impacts the React Native world and kind of the futures and where the ecosystem I see really challenges ahead, but there are challenges that can be attacked by the community. So a little bit of math here. What we do to do some of these things is we get a really large prime to be safe. And if you've ever done any abstract algebra in college or high school or just kind of for fun, which is fun, you essentially you look at an algebraic structure known as a group. And think of this as a clock, because we're going to do modular arithmetic. And I find some root. And what that means is I can just keep multiplying that and do an exponentiation and generate everything on the clock, right? And what we do when we start with these is we take a random salt for the user. Because Cognito actually can do unique identities for users, we take the identity and the password, and we get this value x. And then we calculate g to the x, which is this value v. This is known as a password verifier. And this is actually what gets stored in Cognito user pools, which is managed user directory for your users. And once we have this verifier, the protocol is essentially passing some information back and forth on the network so that rather than the user sending their password to a server for it to be serialized and deserialized and looked up, we don't even store that on the back end. We just store verifiers. And by the end of the process, we have some key here that both systems have it. Now, why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting just to know the security implications of this and how you can build secure auth and auth-Z systems in practice. But to do this, we need to use an algorithm known as Montgomery multiplication. And if you've ever looked into how processors and CPUs handle modular arithmetic, essentially when you get into large exponentiation like this, you have to basically move yourself to a different algebraic space and do some processes, and then once you've simplified it, move back the process. Unfortunately, as we start to look at more of these crypto systems, and there's lots more, right? You could look at elliptic curve cryptography and other things like that. React Native actually doesn't support JIT today. So when you're starting to look at things like type systems and large arrays, especially with really large primes, you're trying to do some of this fast modular arithmetic, there's a little bit of challenges in doing that just in raw JavaScript. And scenarios like this, we still have to dive down into native today. We're trying to look at ways that we can modularize this a little bit more in the future, maybe with polyfills, maybe with other algorithms and techniques, but these are areas that we still see people going down into native today, but we want to push the limits in the future. After this, though, it is a little bit easier. We can use another part of Cognito, which is Federated Identities, to solve your Auth-Z portion, which is passing these tokens over to this service. And you can even filter them down by if you wanted to give people claims like department or HR, they can get different types of roles. As I mentioned, you can do social, you can also do SAML. But you get back something known as AWS credentials. So with AWS credentials, it's a triple. It's a secret key and an access key and a token. The three of these can only be used together. They also expire after a short amount of time, which is 1 hour, but you can use some services in AWS to make that even shorter if you had the need. And why this is important is this gives us an extra level of security. So I talked about this signature version 4 process that we use. This is a way that we do not only crypto offloading, but isolation and scale with mathematical certainty so that you're not just passing a random bearer token, and I use random, but just even a signed bearer token over the network after you've authenticated a user. We can actually fully sign the request with an extra level of security so that you're getting this sort of 4-part HMAC that you can be assured that only that user getting those credentials has access to that specific service. Now, all of this sounds complex, and the message I'd like you to take away from today is there is a lot of security and complexity happening under the covers, but really what I'm talking about here is those 3 tokens you get, you're passing them to a constructor in our SDK, and we do the signing for you. The mathematics around the authentication pieces for SRP protocol, we're providing samples and SDKs to do this. So we not only would want you to use them just because it's easier, but when it comes to security stuff too, you have to really be careful about rolling your own crypto because it's easy to get in trouble with some of these things. So what does our application architecture then look like for some of these techniques? Well, we've got a native bridge for some things like getting these OIDC tokens and doing the SRP process. We're starting to provide more helper code for these things. We've got an auth helper now with the sample that we just released. That React sample that I talked about that we'll be launching later this week is going to have not only an auth helper but also a REST helper that will do some of the signing for just generic REST clients. From there, you're strictly in JavaScript world, right? So you can pass these tokens to Federated Identities, get back your AWS credentials, and then call all types of services, such as that IoT service I was talking about, or S3 file streaming, or maybe you want to use some things like Amazon Lex to do speech analysis or recognition. The kind of sky's the limit there once you get off after this or past this authentication barrier. So demo, I'm going to bring over one of the members of our device firm team, and he's going to walk through some code as I talk through it. So let's start with the console, Hub console. Okay, the first thing is we've actually got this GitHub repo here. If you scroll up to the top, you'll see we've got AWS SDK React Native, and we just pushed 12 hours of sample here. So there's a couple things before we get into the sample. First is we've got sample code on here with this native bridge, but instead of having to learn the AWS console and then set up all these pieces, we've now started to include buttons on here. So you can click this button, as Rohan's just going to do, and this will, in a separate browser, literally launch straight into the console with all that user pool stuff, incognito, configured, federated identities, even hosting and streaming type stuff. So you press a button, and from the GitHub repo, we've actually got a sample YAML in that repo that we're basically doing a post back and creating a project here. This import project is going to take a minute, so while that's running, we're going to run the demo. Cool. So very simple demo that we did. We didn't really go crazy, as you can see, with some UX and stuff like that, but let's use like Rohan. Let's do the registration flow first. So the first thing we're going to show is registration flow. Rohan's going to type in his name, sample password. He's going to put in an email address and then a phone number. I'm going to use yours or mine. Okay, so when he registers that, it's actually going to send him a text message here. And when he gets the text message, this is for a confirmation type flow when it comes to registration. But this same confirmation flow, by the way, is supported with MFA scenarios in the service. So it could be MFA, just two MFA, people put in their password. It could be passwordless to where you just log in with just confirmation codes. That's become very popular recently. Could also be even things like CAPTCHAs, where you're doing constant challenge and response are supported in the service. And now that he's confirmed his user in the system, he's going to sign in, and he's going to get AWS credentials, which are shown on the next screen. So you can see access key, secret key, tokens, and stuff like that. So kill this one, and then kill the packager and start the other one. So the next sample that we're going to show before we end here in a second is, this was kind of going through the full authn and authc scenario, right? So first thing we did was a process of, if you think about it in the background, right, I did that secure remote password protocol process and authenticated, created my password verifier that was stored in the system, logged in and logged out, stuff like this. Then we got past the authentication phase, passed those tokens to Federated Identities, and got our AWS credentials. It's all pretty simple when it stood up. Now, this is also an example of, do the get cognito ID, then connect and subscribe. So this is a couple of samples built into one, which is, first of all, Rohan's streaming this download as he started from an S3 bucket using React Native Video. So just plop a video in a bucket, point it at the URL, and it live streamed down here. We've also got capabilities of doing kind of these real WebSocket connections. So if I start this one, You'll notice popping up on the screen there is, a little bit of a rotation of some AWS service names. What I've actually done is from my second laptop, where I'm subscribed to the same channel as he is, and it's actually pretty real time, because basically what I have is a shell script that's just looping through and publishing each name. But I'm using a region on US East in Virginia. So we're literally going from here in Portland all the way to Virginia and all the way back to this other system, streaming kind of like a Periscope type app over a video with just a handful of codes in React Native. And let's just show the auth helper really quick before we go back to the... Yeah, so an example here is like we've published in these directories, as you can see, like we've got this auth helper where we're trying to basically abstract away some of the heavy lifting that you'd have to do in AWS code. And instead, what you can do is just import very declarative style actions and methods like logging in users, registering and confirming users. And then all you have to do is just manage your React code. So this is kind of the direction that we're going in the future for some of these things. Thanks, Rohan. OK, so just to wrap up here, and I think I'm really close on time, which is great. So a lot of challenges have already been covered in the React Native ecosystem, right? Things like keychain access, which are usually really difficult to do, even difficult to do on native. React Native supports these things now. Push notifications. It's still a little bit rough around the edges, but it's getting easier. You don't always have to just go down into your native ecosystem and code there. Even like doing high frames per second and stuff like this. But there's still some work to do, especially as when you think of like the kind of graph of where technologies get adopted, and kind of what we see in the next phase of some of the React Native ecosystem is it should be easier to do some of these advanced algorithms and mathematics straight in the JavaScript world without constantly dropping down into native. It should be able to do things like background transfer without constantly dropping into native. And what I'd like to leave you with is a couple of things. I've got this point on scheduling and batching, but this is an image of an architecture. It's got nothing to do with AWS Lambda. It's actually a big data architecture for processing known as the Lambda architecture. And I think it's really interesting to learn both client-side front-end engineering in general, as well as distributed systems engineering if you've got the interest, because what we continually see from the AWS perspective is working with customers. A lot of patterns that we see on the infrastructure side, right? So this is an example of everybody wants stuff real time, right? But the way that real-time systems really work is there's usually some sort of a batch layer and then a speed layer and some sort of mediator for doing merging and negotiation. Well, we see that on the client sides now a lot too, right? So when you're thinking of ad tech and React Native or other types of mobile technologies, there's usually some sort of batching process for analytics. Then there's probably some sort of real time like you saw in PubSub and things like that. And then some sort of mediator and merging these type of events, so forth on the back end. So, I would encourage you to look at the front-end engineering side and see how challenges were solved there, but also look into some different spaces too, and see how solutions came up in maybe distributed systems platforms or other sorts of spaces, and see how we can port those over to React Native. And the final slide I'll leave you with is, I guess the main takeaway is one, hopefully you see AWS is investing in React Native, but we want to, hear more from you, hear what we can do better, and hear what we can keep building upon. But also you can leverage some of these services, as you saw, just kind of a button click. You get some configuration, you can drop it into your code, and you can really build some secure and advanced functionality very quickly using, React Native and AWS services together. So thank you.